Blood pooled in the cracks of the rough-hewn cabin floor as Rebecca Hartwell's screams tore through the Wyoming night. Her fingers clawed at the quilted blanket beneath her, each contraction feeling like her body was being torn apart from the inside. The December wind howled across Pine Ridge Settlement, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of a blizzard that could bury them all by morning. Outside, her husband Elijah paced like a caged wolf, his boots wearing a deep groove in the frozen dirt. Each of Rebecca's cries felt like a knife twisting in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to cross the threshold. Not when he feared what he might find waiting inside. Please God, he thought desperately, let this child be whole. Let this child be strong. The prayer felt hollow even as he formed it. In this unforgiving land, prayers were often answered with silence, and hope was a luxury that could get a man killed. Elijah had seen too many families destroyed by weakness, children who couldn't work livestock, that couldn't survive dreams, that couldn't weather the brutal reality of frontier life. Get in there and help your wife. Doc Morrison barked from the doorway, his sleeves rolled up and hands stained crimson. Sweat beaded on the old physician's forehead despite the bitter cold. Now that's women's work. Elijah spat, though his voice cracked with suppressed anguish. Besides, Constance Morrison is tending to her. Inside the cabin, Rebecca's world had narrowed to pain and the desperate need to bring her child safely into the world. She thought of her teaching days in Ohio, when she'd believed education and kindness could overcome any obstacle. That naive girl seemed like a stranger, now replaced by a woman who'd learned that survival demanded sacrifices she'd never imagined. Hold on, little one. She whispered silently to the child fighting to be born. Hold on. Your mama's here. Another scream tore from her throat, weaker this time, as her strength began to ebb. Then suddenly, blessedly, the pressure released. For a moment, there was only her ragged breathing and the whistle of wind through the gaps in the cabin walls. Then silence. The kind of silence that made grown men hold their breath and pray to whatever gods might be listening. When the baby's cry finally came, it was thin and reedy. Nothing like the robust wail that should announce new life on the frontier. Doc Morrison's weathered face went pale in the lamplight, spilling from the windows as he examined the infant. "It's a boy," he said quietly when he emerged, his voice carefully neutral. Elijah stopped pacing, and the doctor's hesitation spoke volumes. In his 40 years of frontier medicine, he'd learned to deliver bad news with surgical precision. The child, his left arm didn't form properly. Withered. Muscle and bone development is severely limited. Elijah's face transformed in the flickering light, all the love and anticipation draining away like water from a broken vessel. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as a memory surfaced unbidden. His younger brother Jacob, born with a club foot, dead of pneumonia before his 2nd birthday, because he couldn't run from the cold like other children. "Cursed!" He whispered the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. Then louder with growing conviction, "Cursed!" From inside the cabin came Rebecca's voice, weak but fierce with a mother's love. "Let me hold my son." But Elijah was already walking away, his shadow swallowed by the darkness beyond the reach of the lamp, carrying with him the weight of a choice that would damn them all. The Wyoming Territory in 1867 was a land that broke the weak and barely suffered the strong. Pine Ridge Settlement clung to existence in a valley between harsh mountains and endless prairie where winter could kill a man in hours and summer offered little respite from the constant struggle for survival. Rebecca Hartwell had been Rebecca Porter, once a schoolteacher from Cincinnati with soft hands and softer dreams. She'd come west with a government program to bring education to the frontier, carrying books and hope in equal measure. The reality of Wyoming had been a harsh, awakening one-room schoolhouses that doubled as emergency shelters children who attended class sporadically between the demands of ranch work and a community that viewed learning as a luxury they couldn't afford. She'd met Elijah at a church social in Cheyenne, a tall, stern rancher with calloused hands and ice-blue eyes who spoke of building something lasting in this unforgiving land. He'd courted her with awkward intensity, bringing her wildflowers and carved trinkets, while speaking of the ranch he was carving from the wilderness. "I need a partner," he'd told her during one of their walks along the creek. "Someone who understands that out here, everything depends on being strong enough to survive." Their courtship had been brief, their wedding simple, performed by a circuit preacher in the settlement's tiny church. Their first year of marriage had been a series of harsh lessons about what it took to survive, where civilization barely held purchase. Pine Ridge settlement numbered barely 40 souls scattered across a dozen homesteads, and a handful of businesses clustered around a single dirt road. The general store, managed by the perpetually worried Jonas Hartley, sold everything from flour to ammunition. The saloon, presided over by a former cavalry sergeant named Murphy, served as the unofficial town hall where decisions were made over whiskey and poker. The blacksmith, a giant named Otto Schmidt, doubled as the settlement's dentist and veterinarian. At the center of it all stood a small church with a bell that had been hauled overland from St. Louis at considerable expense. Here, weakness was not merely discouraged, it was deadly. A lame horse was shot, a sick cow was butchered before disease could spread, and families who couldn't pull their weight found themselves ostracized until they either strengthened or starved. Elijah ran cattle with 3 neighboring ranchers, who formed the unofficial council that governed the settlement. Big Tom Fletcher commanded respect through sheer size and volume, a bear of a man whose voice could carry across the valley when he called his herds. Samuel Cross brought military precision to their operations, his years as a cavalry officer evident in everything from his ramrod posture to his strategic thinking. The youngest, Marcus Webb, had arrived barely 2 years ago, but had already proven himself through 2 brutal winters that claimed half his stock and nearly his life. Survival isn't personal out here, Samuel had explained to Rebecca during her first month in the settlement. It's mathematical. Every mouth that can't feed itself weakens the whole group. Every back that can't work makes the load heavier for everyone else. The women of Pine Ridge had their own hierarchy, led by Constance Morrison, the preacher's wife. A pinched-faced woman from Boston, who'd followed her husband west on a mission to bring civilization to the godless frontier, she maintained Eastern propriety with iron discipline despite the primitive conditions. Under her watchful eye, the settlement's wives formed a tight circle of mutual support and rigid social expectations. "We are the light in the wilderness," Constance would remind them during their weekly sewing circles. "If we lose our standards, we become no better than the savages that surround us." 10 miles north, hidden in the rolling hills that marked traditional hunting grounds, a small band of northern Cheyenne struggled with their own survival. Led by Chief Standing Bear, they watched the steady encroachment of white settlers with growing unease. Their world was shrinking with each passing season as treaties were broken and traditional hunting grounds disappeared beneath plows and cattle ranches. Among them was Greywolf, a warrior of 32 summers whose English was nearly flawless. Learned from Jesuit missionaries during a brief period when relations between their peoples had seemed possible. Greywolf carried scars, both visible and hidden, a knife wound across his ribs from a skirmish with Crow warriors, and deeper wounds from the night 3 years past when cavalry soldiers had mistaken his peaceful camp for a war party and opened fire. His wife, Morning Star, had died with their infant daughter in her arms, cut down while trying to shield the child from bullets meant for warriors who weren't even present. The soldiers had claimed they'd acted in self-defense, that the camp had shown hostile intent. No one had been punished. No apologies had been offered. Since that night, Greywolf had become something of a lone wolf among his people, still loyal to the tribe, but increasingly drawn to solitary hunts that took him far from camp. Unlike many of his brothers, he studied the whites with curious rather than purely hostile eyes. He saw in their desperate struggles echoes of his own people's fight for survival against impossible odds. They fear us, he thought as he watched the smoke rise from Pine Ridge's chimneys, but they fear their own weakness even more. It was an understanding that would soon prove prophetic. The baby who would change everything had been born as the first blizzard of winter began to build on the northern horizon. Doc Morrison had worked by lamplight, while Constance Morrison muttered prayers and practical advice in equal measure. Rebecca's labor had been long and difficult, her strength nearly spent when the child finally emerged. Something's wrong with the arm. Constance had whispered when she first saw the infant's left side, thin and twisted ending in a hand, with fingers that would never grip properly. But Rebecca had taken one look at her son's face, perfect and red and angry at the world, and felt love crash over her like a flood. "He's beautiful," she'd breathed, cradling him against her chest, despite the horrified looks from the other women. The child's cries were strong, despite his physical limitation, his dark eyes bright and alert as they fixed on his mother's face. In that moment, Rebecca saw not a burden or a curse, but a person small and vulnerable, but unmistakably alive and deserving of love. Outside, when Doc Morrison delivered his diagnosis, Elijah's reaction had been swift and final. The memory of his brother Jacob's death haunted him the way the club-footed boy had struggled to keep up, the way that struggle had eventually killed him when he couldn't run fast enough from danger. "I won't watch another child suffer like that," Elijah told himself. "I won't put this family through that kind of slow torture." But beneath his rational justifications lay a deeper fear that in a land where strength was the only currency that mattered, a weak child would mark them all as targets. Indians, outlaws, even fellow settlers might see a family with a disabled member as easy prey. The settlement had gone quiet that night, windows dark and doors barred against more than just the coming storm. Everyone knew that difficult decisions lay ahead, choices that would test the very foundations of their community. They had no idea how severely those foundations would be tested in the days to come. 3 days after the birth, Elijah made his decision with the cold calculation of a man who'd learned that sentiment was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. Rebecca sat in the rocking chair her husband had built during her pregnancy, nursing her son by the pale light, filtering through their cabin's single window. Snow had begun falling heavily, and she could hear cattle lowing in distress from the shelter behind the barn. The baby was feeding well despite his early struggles, and Rebecca had allowed herself to hope that time might soften Elijah's heart. She should have known better. The cabin door exploded inward with such force that it bounced off the log wall. Elijah stood silhouetted against the white morning, his face a mask of controlled fury that made him look like a stranger. Behind him, she could see the shapes of other men, the settlement's leadership come to pass judgment. "It's time," Elijah said, his voice flat and emotionless. Rebecca's arms instinctively tightened around her baby. Time for what? To face reality. To do what should have been done 3 days ago. Big Tom Fletcher stepped into the cabin, his massive frame seeming to fill the small space. "Mrs. Hartwell, we've come to a decision about your situation." Rebecca looked from face to face, searching for any sign of compassion. Samuel Cross stood at military attention, his expression carved from stone. Marcus Webb lingered near the door, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "My situation." Rebecca's voice rose. "You mean my son?" "We mean the burden you're asking this community to bear," Samuel Cross said with the precision of a man delivering a military briefing. "Every resource we spend keeping that child alive is a resource taken from families with a future." The words hit her like physical blows. These men had eaten at her table, had praised her teaching, had called her friend. Now they spoke of her newborn son as if he were livestock to be evaluated for slaughter. "He's 3 days old," she whispered. "How can you possibly know what he might become?" "We know enough," Elijah said, and his voice carried a pain that made his cruelty even more devastating. "I've seen what happens to children like him, Rebecca. I've watched them suffer, watched their families tear themselves apart, trying to keep them alive in a world that has no place for them. Big Tom Fletcher cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the role he'd been asked to play. "It ain't personal, Mrs. Hartwell. But winter's coming hard, and we can't spare resources for something that'll never contribute to our survival." Rebecca rose from the chair the baby clutched protectively against her chest. "Contribute. He's a human being, not a business investment. Maitsette, that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed out here." Samuel Cross replied. "Every mouth that can't feed itself, every back that can't work makes us all weaker. Makes us vulnerable to the Indians who are watching for any sign that we're not strong enough to defend what we've built." The mention of Indians sent a chill through the room. Everyone knew the Cheyenne were restless, that tensions were rising as more settlers pushed into traditional hunting grounds. Any sign of weakness could invite an attack that would destroy everything they'd worked to build. "What are you asking me to do?" Rebecca's voice barely rose above a whisper. Elijah stepped forward, his jaw set with grim determination. "Take him out to the prairie and leave him. The cold will be quick, more merciful than watching him struggle for years before dying anyway." The room went silent, except for the baby's soft breathing and the whistle of wind through gaps in the cabin walls. Rebecca felt the world tilt around her as she realized these men, her neighbors, her husband, were asking her to murder her own child. "I won't do it," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can't." Elijah's face hardened further. "Then you've made your choice." What happened next unfolded with the inexorable force of an avalanche. Elijah gathered Rebecca's few possessions, her Bible, her teaching certificates, the photograph of her parents, 2 changes of clothes, and stuffed them into a canvas bag with mechanical precision. "You chose that thing over me," he said, his voice thick with disgust and something that might have been grief. "Over your community. Over your own people." He threw the bag into the mud outside the cabin door, where it landed with a wet sound that seemed to echo across the valley. Rebecca's teaching certificates scattered in the wind, years of education and hope disappearing into the snow. "Please," she begged, but the word fell into silence. "You've got until sundown to be gone from my land." Elijah said, his voice cracking slightly on the word "my." "After that, I'll treat you like any other trespasser." Rebecca walked past him into the storm, her baby wrapped in the single blanket Constance Morrison had grudgingly allowed her to keep. Behind her, she heard the cabin door slam shut, with a finality that echoed across the valley like a gunshot. The wind cut through her thin dress like knives, and the baby began to cry, a thin, desperate sound that the storm seemed eager to swallow. Rebecca stumbled through the snow toward the settlement's main road, hope dying in her chest as she realized that her exile was only beginning. The first door she tried was the general store, where Jonas Hartley looked up from his ledger with eyes that refused to meet hers. "We're closed," he said, though the sign clearly indicated otherwise. "Jonas, please. I just need—" "No." His voice was firm, final. "I can't help you, Mrs. Hartwell. None of us can." She tried every business, every home, every person she'd thought of as a friend. The pattern was always the same: averted eyes, closed doors, the terrible politeness of people who'd made a decision they couldn't afford to question. By nightfall, Rebecca found herself at the settlement's edge with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The temperature was dropping fast, and her son's cries had grown weaker. In desperation, she managed to construct a crude lean-to against a stand of scrub pines, using branches and canvas to create a pitiful windbreak. That first night nearly killed them both. Rebecca dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes to check that the baby was still breathing. His tiny face was pale in the starlight, his lips tinged blue despite her efforts to keep him warm. But he was alive. Against all odds and conditions that should have claimed them both, her son was still fighting. It was a fight that would soon attract the attention of eyes that watched from the darkness, eyes that saw strength where her own people saw only weakness. By the end of the first week, Rebecca had learned to survive in ways she'd never imagined possible. The lean-to that had been a desperate shelter on that first night had evolved into something approaching livable, reinforced with additional branches, banked with snow for insulation, and positioned to catch the morning sun. She'd fashioned a small fire pit from stones, though keeping it fed with wet wood remained a constant struggle. The baby, she'd begun calling him Thomas, after her father had proven remarkably resilient. His cries were still strong, his appetite steady, and his dark eyes followed her movements with an intelligence that seemed to transcend his physical limitations. But survival wasn't just about shelter and warmth. It was about sustaining hope in the face of systematic cruelty. Rebecca's first attempt to trade for supplies had come on the fourth day, when hunger had driven her to approach the general store with her wedding ring, a simple gold band that represented everything she'd lost. Jonas Hartley had looked at the ring with obvious avarice, turning it over in his weathered hands, while his wife watched from the back room. "It's good gold," Rebecca had said, trying to keep desperation from her voice. "Worth enough for flour, salt, maybe some milk for the baby." For a moment she'd thought he might relent. Then his wife had stepped forward, her face set in hard lines. "Jonas, you know what the council decided. Anyone who helps her is going against the settlement's best interests." The ring had been handed back with words that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. Can't help you." Every door in Pine Ridge had delivered the same message. Her former students' parents, who'd once praised her teaching, now crossed the street to avoid her. Women who'd shared meals and gossip treated her as if she'd become invisible. Only the children showed any sympathy, their innocent faces reflecting confusion at adult cruelty they couldn't understand. But they were quickly hushed and pulled away whenever they showed interest in the strange woman and her baby living at the settlement's edge. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her exile. Rebecca had always been a social creature, drawing strength from connection and community. Now she found herself talking to Thomas just to hear a human voice, even if that voice was her own. "Your daddy thinks we're weak," she whispered to him during their fifth night, watching his face in the firelight. "But we're still here, aren't we? Still fighting." Thomas responded with what might have been a smile gas, probably, but Rebecca chose to interpret it as agreement. The physical challenges were relentless. Melting snow for water took precious fuel. Finding edible plants beneath the snow required knowledge she was still acquiring through dangerous trial and error. Pine nuts provided some nutrition, and the inner bark of certain trees could be chewed for sustenance. And she'd even managed to catch a rabbit in a snare fashioned from bootlaces, but it wasn't enough. Rebecca could feel her strength ebbing, her milk production decreasing as her body began to consume itself for fuel. Thomas's cries had grown weaker, his periods of sleep longer and deeper than was healthy for an infant. On the seventh day, she made a desperate decision to venture further from the settlement in search of resources others might have overlooked. The trek through knee-deep snow was exhausting, but she managed to find a cache of wild onions and some dried berries that had escaped the attention of animals and earlier foragers. It was on the return journey that she first noticed the signs, tracks in the snow that didn't belong to any of the settlement's residents. Too large for a woman, too deliberate for a man walking casually. They paralleled her path for nearly a quarter mile before disappearing into rocky ground, where snow couldn't hold an impression. Someone was watching her. Rebecca's first instinct was terror. Stories of Indian raids filled the settlement's conversations, tales of women and children taken in the night, of homesteads burned and families scattered to the winds. If the Cheyenne had been tracking her movements, studying her weaknesses, but as days passed and nothing happened, her fear began to transform into curiosity. The watcher, if watcher there was, made no aggressive moves. No attempts at contact, no signs of hostile intent. Instead, she began noticing small changes around her camp that suggested outside intervention. Her fire never quite died completely, even when she was certain the embers should have burned out. The pile of dry wood she'd carefully hoarded sometimes seemed larger than she remembered. Once she'd found a small pouch of what looked like wild herbs near her shelter plants she didn't recognize, but which, when brewed into tea, seemed to restore some of her strength. The gifts, if gifts they were, appeared with no pattern. She could discern always when she was away from camp or deep in sleep. She searched for signs of the giver, but found nothing except those occasional tracks that led nowhere, and told her nothing except that someone with skill and knowledge was moving through her world like a ghost. By the end of the second week, Rebecca had reached a grim understanding. She and Thomas were living on borrowed time, sustained by mysterious charity from an unknown source. Whether that source was friend or enemy remained to be seen, but without it, they would already be dead. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself oddly comforted by the knowledge that in this harsh land, where her own people had cast her out, someone or something was choosing to help rather than harm. She had no idea that her mysterious benefactor was wrestling with conflicts of his own, or that their strange arrangement was about to attract the attention of forces that would transform both their lives forever. Greywolf had been watching the white settlement for weeks before the woman appeared at its edge. But it was her refusal to die that first caught his attention. From his favorite hunting spot on the ridge above Pine Ridge, he'd observed the daily rhythms of the whites, their desperate struggle to carve civilization from wilderness, their constant vigilance against threats both real and imagined. He'd seen families arrive with hope and leave with broken dreams, watched the strong survive, while the weak simply disappeared. The woman was different. Cast out by her own people in conditions that should have killed her within days, she persisted with a stubbornness that reminded him of the scrub oak that somehow survived on the windswept peaks, twisted by adversity, but refusing to break. Greywolf's English was good enough to understand fragments of conversation that drifted up from the settlement, especially on clear nights, when voices carried on the wind. He'd pieced together the story of Rebecca Hartwell's exile, the settlement's decision to abandon a mother and her imperfect child to the mercy of winter. The cruelty was nothing new. He'd witnessed similar scenes among his own people, when resources grew scarce and difficult choices had to be made. But there was something about this particular woman's situation that resonated with old pain in his chest. His brother Dancing Bear had been born with a twisted foot that never properly healed. Among the Cheyenne, such differences were often seen as marks of spiritual significance, signs that the spirits had chosen someone for a special path. Dancing Bear had become one of their most respected storytellers, his physical limitation somehow freeing his imagination to soar beyond ordinary boundaries. But Greywolf also remembered the arguments among the elders, the voices that had suggested abandoning his brother to the elements. Only their grandmother's wisdom and influence had prevented such a tragedy. These whites know nothing of seeing strength in difference, he thought, as he watched Rebecca struggle to keep her fire alive. They see only burden where they should see possibility. The decision to help came gradually, each small intervention justified by its own logic. A bundle of dry wood left where she might find its surplus from his own gathering. Wild herbs that grew in abundance higher on the mountain medicine his people used for nursing mothers. A warm buffalo robe, carefully aged to look like something blown from a traveler's pack, rather than deliberately placed. Greywolf was careful to leave no obvious signs of his presence, to make each gift seem like fortunate coincidence, rather than deliberate aid. His tribal council had been clear about avoiding contact with whites. Relations were tense enough without individual warriors making unauthorized contact that might be seen as provocation or scouting for an attack. But the longer he watched Rebecca's struggle, the more invested he became in her survival. There was courage in the way she faced each day's challenges, determination in the way she protected her child against impossible odds. When he heard her talking softly to the baby during their long, cold nights, he caught echoes of the same love his own mother had shown Dancing Bear. The gifts became more frequent, more substantial. Food that could be explained as scattered from hunting kills. Tools that might have been dropped by careless travelers. Always careful, always deniable, but increasingly essential to her survival. Greywolf told himself he was simply honoring the memory of his brother, protecting innocence as Dancing Bear would have wanted. But deeper currents moved beneath his rational justifications. Loneliness that had grown heavier since losing his wife and daughter, a sense that helping this woman and her child might bring some meaning to his own suffering. 3 weeks into their strange arrangement, everything changed. Greywolf had left dried meat and fresh water near Rebecca's camp, timing his approach for the pre-dawn hours when she typically slept deepest. But as he prepared to retreat, voices carried across the valley from the settlement below. I'm tired of watching her survive on luck and charity, making us all look weak. What time to finish what we started. Greywolf froze, straining to hear more. Through gaps in the conversation, he gathered that some of the settlement's men were planning to take more direct action against Rebecca. The words "drive her out" and "territorial boundary" suggested they intended to force her away from even the marginal shelter she'd managed to create. The warrior in him recognized a tactical problem. Rebecca was vulnerable, isolated, with no means of defending herself if the whites decided to use force. Her mysterious survival had apparently become an embarrassment to the settlement's leadership, proof that their harsh judgment might have been wrong. But the tactical problem was also a moral one. Greywolf had invested weeks in keeping this woman and child alive. To abandon them now when they faced their greatest threat would make his previous efforts meaningless. For the first time since beginning his secret aid, Greywolf considered direct intervention. Not the careful, deniable assistance he'd been providing, but open protection that would require him to reveal himself and risk everything that revelation might bring. The decision tormented him through the remaining hours before dawn. Direct contact violated every instruction from his tribal council. It would mark him as a rogue, potentially bringing down suspicion and retaliation on his entire people. If the whites interpreted his presence as a prelude to attack, the resulting conflict could destroy years of careful neutrality. But the alternative was watching a woman and infant be murdered by men too cowardly to do the killing quickly. As morning light began to filter through the pines, Greywolf made his choice. He would reveal himself to Rebecca Hartwell, explain the danger she faced, and offer what protection he could provide. Whether she would accept help from a Cheyenne warrior, whether she would see salvation or additional threat in his offer, remained to be discovered. He had no way of knowing that his decision would set in motion events that would test not only his own courage, but the very foundations of both communities that claimed this harsh land as home. The sound of horses approaching from the settlement made the choice for him. 8 riders, armed and determined, were heading directly for Rebecca's camp. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of one woman and her child, but the future relationship between two peoples balanced on the knife's edge of war. Greywolf stepped from the tree line just as Rebecca emerged from her shelter, her baby clutched protectively against her chest. Their eyes met across the snowy expanse, and in that moment, both of them understood that everything was about to change. "You are the one they cast out," Greywolf said, his voice carrying clearly across the cold morning air. Rebecca's first instinct was terror. Stories of Indian attacks filled every conversation in the settlement, tales of women taken and children scalped, of homesteads burned and families murdered in their sleep. Alone with her infant son, miles from any help, she was completely vulnerable to whatever this warrior intended. But something in his bearing gave her pause. He moved without haste or aggression, his hands visible and empty. When he was still 30 yards away, he stopped and raised one hand in what she somehow understood was a gesture of peace. "You've been watching me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Greywolf nodded slowly. "For many days. You have been persistent in your survival." Despite everything, Rebecca felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. Persistent. That's one word for it. "Your people." Greywolf continued, taking a careful step closer. "They see weakness where mine would see different strength." The words hit her like a physical blow, carrying implications she wasn't ready to process. "What do you mean?" Greywolf began to speak in a voice that carried the cadence of ancient wisdom. "My brother was born with a foot that would not heal straight. The bones grew twisted and he could never run as fast as other children, never hunt in the way our young men were expected to hunt. Rebecca's heart began to race as she sensed where this was leading. Some among us whispered that he should be left for the spirits to claim. Greywolf continued. But our grandmother was wise. She said the spirits do not make mistakes. They mark certain children for purposes we may not immediately understand. He was close enough now that Rebecca could see the pain in his dark eyes, old grief, carefully controlled, but never fully healed. My brother became one of our most honored storytellers, keeper of our traditions, counselor to those who faced impossible choices. His twisted foot became irrelevant compared to the straight path of his wisdom. Greywolf gestured toward the settlement visible in the distance. Your people cast you out because they fear your child's difference might make them appear weak. They do not understand that true strength sometimes comes disguised as limitation. Tears began streaming down Rebecca's face. For 3 weeks, she'd endured her neighbor's certainty that her son was cursed, broken, better off dead. To hear someone speak of difference as potential rather than doom was almost more than her battered heart could bear. He has no future here, she whispered. They'll never accept him. Perhaps, Greywolf said quietly. But that says more about their blindness than about his worth. Before Rebecca could respond, and the sound of approaching horses carried across the valley. Both turned toward the settlement, where a group of riders was forming up in the main street. Even at distance, Rebecca could make out familiar figures, her husband's tall frame, the broad shoulders of Big Tom Fletcher, the military bearing of Samuel Cross. They're coming for me, she said, and her voice carried a strange calm despite the fear coursing through her veins. Greywolf's expression hardened as he counted the riders. How many weapons? All of them are armed. They... Rebecca stopped, sudden understanding flooding through her. You have to leave. If they find you here with me, they'll assume the worst. Nakalbrahab, they will assume I am threat to their settlement. Greywolf agreed. It would give them the excuse they seek to justify violence against my people. But instead of retreating, he remained where he stood. I will not abandon you to face them alone. You don't understand, Rebecca said desperately. Your presence will make everything worse. They already see Indians as enemies. If they think you're helping me, they'll use it as proof that I'm a traitor to my own kind. Greywolf studied the approaching riders, his warrior's mind calculating odds and angles. And if I leave, they will drive you out or kill you, maybe. But if you stay, they might kill us both and use it to justify attacking your people. The moral complexity of their situation settled between them like a weight. Every choice carried consequences that extended far beyond their individual fates. The riders were close enough now that Rebecca could hear voices, could see weapons glinting in the morning sun. At their head rode not just her husband, but a stranger, a younger man with similar features who could only be family. There is something you must know, Greywolf said quietly, his eyes fixed on the approaching threat. I am not supposed to be here. My people have forbidden contact with whites. If war comes because of my presence, then go, Rebecca said firmly. I won't be responsible for that. Greywolf looked at her for a long moment, then at the baby who had begun to fuss in her arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. My wife and daughter died because of hatred between our peoples, he said. I will not let that hatred claim another innocent child if I can prevent it. The riders were close enough now that individual voices carried on the wind. Rebecca caught fragments of conversation that chilled her blood. Should have finished this weeks ago. Making fools of us all. A time to end it permanently. As the horses drew nearer, Rebecca could see that this wasn't the simple eviction she'd been expecting. The men's faces carried a grim determination that spoke of final solutions rather than mere relocation. Greywolf stepped back toward the tree line, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. while remaining partially concealed. It was a compromise that satisfied neither safety nor honor, but it was the best either of them could manage. The lead rider, the stranger, with Elijah's features, called out when they were still 50 yards away. "Rebecca Hartwell, by order of the Pine Ridge Settlement Council, you are commanded to remove yourself from this territory immediately." "Now, this isn't your land, Caleb Hartwell," Rebecca replied, recognizing the family resemblance. "It's open territory, and I have as much right to be here as anyone." Caleb's smile was cold as winter steel. Rights are for people who contribute to civilization, not outcasts who consort with savages. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca felt her world tilt as she realized this wasn't about simple exile anymore. They suspected she'd been receiving help, and they'd drawn their own conclusions about the source. Behind Caleb, she could see doubt flickering across some faces. Marcus Webb looked uncomfortable with whatever plan they'd made. Even Big Tom Fletcher seemed uncertain about the wisdom of their course. But doubt wouldn't be enough to stop what came next. Caleb had clearly come prepared for more than conversation, and his next words confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. "We know you've had help surviving out here," he said, his voice carrying across the frozen ground. "No woman could last 3 weeks in these conditions without assistance. The question is, what did you promise your Indian friends in return for their charity?" The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face as she realized how her miraculous survival must look to men already primed to see conspiracy and betrayal. "That's not I haven't," she stammered, but Caleb cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Save your denials. We found the evidence. Moccasin tracks around your camp. Gift items that didn't come from any white trader. You've been feeding information to the Cheyenne, haven't you? Telling them about our defenses, our numbers, our weaknesses." Behind him, Samuel Cross nodded grimly. "It explains everything. How she's survived, why the Indians haven't attacked yet. They're waiting for the right moment, using her as their spy inside our community." Rebecca's mind raced, trying to find words that might diffuse the explosive situation. But before she could speak, a new voice cut through the tension, quiet, controlled, and coming from the tree line behind her. "Your accusations are false." Greywolf stepped into view, his hands empty, but his presence commanding immediate attention. Every gun in the group swung toward him, and Rebecca felt the morning air crackle with the potential for violence. "Well, well," Caleb said, his smile turning predatory. "Look what we have here. The savage shows himself at last." "I am Greywolf of the Northern Cheyenne," the warrior said with quiet dignity. "I have taken nothing from your people, harmed no one. I came here alone." Alone. Samuel Cross's military training was evident in how quickly he began scanning for additional threats. "Indians don't travel alone in winter. Where are your war party?" "There is no war party. I hunt alone." "Wooher, hunt what?" Big Tom Fletcher demanded, his massive frame intimidating even on horseback. "Our cattle, our horses, or information about our defenses." Greywolf's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I hunt game to feed myself. Nothing more." "Mighty convenient." Caleb snarled. "Finding you here having friendly conversations with our cast-off woman makes a man wonder what kind of arrangement you two have worked out." The implication was clear and damning. Rebecca felt sick as she realized how their innocent encounter was being twisted into evidence of treason and conspiracy. "It's not what you think," she said desperately. "I never asked for help. I didn't even know who was helping you." Caleb's voice dripped with contempt. "So you admit there was help, aid and comfort given to our enemies while our own community suffers?" Elijah finally spoke, his voice raw with pain and fury that made his words cut even deeper. "Jesus Christ, Rebecca. Wasn't it enough to choose that freak child over your own husband? Now you're consorting with the very savages who want to kill us all." The words lanced through her like cold steel. This from the man who'd once promised to love and protect her, who'd built their cabin with his own hands and spoken of the children they'd raised together. Greywolf stepped forward slightly, his patience finally fraying. Your wife chose love over fear. If that makes her your enemy, then you are smaller men than I believed. The words hit the gathered riders like a match to gunpowder. Caleb's face flushed red with rage. How dare you speak of our women, you red bastard? How dare I? What Greywolf's composure cracked just enough to let his own anger show through. How dare I speak truth? You cast out a mother and newborn child to die in winter, then call yourselves civilized. You see charity as treason and kindness as weakness. That's enough talk. Samuel Cross barked, his military authority cutting through the escalating tensions. We didn't come here to debate philosophy with a redskin. He gestured to two of the other riders. Marcus, Tom, secure the woman. We're taking her to the territorial boundary as planned. And him. Caleb nodded toward Greywolf, his hand moving to his sidearm. Cross's smile was thin and predatory. Well, we can't have an Indian spy reporting our business to his war chief, can we? The meaning was unmistakable. Rebecca felt the world tilt around her as she realized these men, neighbors who'd shared meals at her table, who'd helped raise her cabin, were preparing to commit murder. No, she said, stepping between Greywolf and the circling riders. I won't let you do this. Get out of the way, Rebecca, Caleb ordered. This doesn't concern you anymore. Like hell it doesn't. Rebecca's voice rose to a shout. This man saved my life, saved my son's life. He left food and firewood when I was dying and asked for nothing in return. Her words seemed to give some of the riders pause. Marcus Webb's face was troubled, and she could see uncertainty flickering in Big Tom Fletcher's eyes. But Caleb's resolve never wavered. Touching story. The broken woman and the savage united against decent folk. Makes it easier, actually. He drew his pistol with practiced ease. 2 problems, 1 solution. The Caleb, wait! The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, young enough that civilization hadn't been completely burned out of him. Look at what we're doing. 8 armed men about to murder a wounded Indian and a woman with a baby. We're protecting our community. Caleb snapped, but Rebecca could see his certainty wavering slightly under Marcus's challenge. From what I see, a man who could have killed any of us from ambush if he'd wanted. Instead, he reveals himself to protect a woman who is starving. If that makes him our enemy, then maybe we're the ones who are wrong. The words hung in the cold air like a moral challenge. Around the circle, Rebecca could see the other men wrestling with doubts they'd tried to suppress. But doubt and conscience weren't enough to stop what happened next. The confrontation exploded with sudden, terrifying violence when Caleb's patience finally snapped. Enough of this bleeding heart nonsense. He roared, spurring his horse forward and raising his pistol. I'm ending this charade right now. Greywolf moved with the fluid speed of a hunting cat, diving sideways as Caleb's gun roared. The bullet whined past his ear and shattered the trunk of a pine tree, sending splinters flying like deadly rain. Take him alive, Samuel Cross shouted, but his order was lost in the chaos that erupted as every horse in the group reared and plunged, spooked by the sudden gunfire. Rebecca found herself knocked aside as Big Tom Fletcher's mount crashed past her, the big man fighting to control his panicked horse while trying to draw his own weapon. She stumbled backward with Thomas clutched against her chest, the baby's terrified wails adding to the cacophony of shouts and gunfire. Greywolf rolled behind Rebecca's makeshift shelter, using the scanty cover to buy precious seconds. But the lean-to provided little protection against rifle bullets, and splinters exploded from the logs as the riders found their range. I got you pinned, savage, Caleb yelled, dismounting for a better shot angle. Nowhere to run now. But Greywolf had no intention of running. From his position behind the shelter, he could see Rebecca trying to protect her screaming infant while bullets flew around them. The sight of the woman and child in mortal danger because of his presence ignited something primal in his warrior's heart. With a war cry that echoed across the valley, Greywolf burst from cover, not retreating, but charging directly at the nearest rider. Marcus Webb, caught off guard by the unexpected attack, barely managed to swing his rifle around before the Cheyenne warrior crashed into his horse's flank. The impact sent both horse and rider tumbling into the snow. Marcus rolled clear, dazed but unhurt, while his mount scrambled to its feet and bolted toward the settlement in blind panic. "He's got Marcus!" Big Tom Fletcher bellowed, spurring his own horse toward the struggle. But Greywolf was already moving, using Marcus's fallen rifle as a club to drive back the next nearest rider. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. What had been an execution was now a running battle, with Greywolf using speed and desperation to even odds that should have been impossible to overcome. But numbers and weapons eventually told. As Greywolf grappled with Tom Fletcher's horse, trying to unseat the massive rider, Caleb approached from his blind spot with cold calculation. "Hold still, you red bastard." Caleb snarled, taking careful aim. "This ends now." The shot echoed across the valley like thunder. Greywolf cried out in pain and stumbled, blood streaming from a wound in his left shoulder. But instead of falling, he turned to face his attacker with eyes that blazed with undiminished defiance. "Is that all you have?" he gasped, still holding the rifle he'd taken from Marcus. "Is that the best your courage can manage?" Caleb's face twisted with rage at the mockery. "I'll show you courage, savage." He raised his pistol for the killing shot, but before he could fire, Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Stop, all of you, just stop." She stood in the middle of the battlefield, her baby still clutched protectively in her arms, her face streaming with tears, but her voice strong with desperate authority. "Look at yourselves," she shouted. "Look at what you've become. You came here to drive out a woman and child, and now you're trying to murder a man who did nothing but show kindness." The riders paused, some visibly shaken by the sight of Rebecca standing among the chaos with her infant son. Even Caleb hesitated, his gun still trained on Greywolf, but his finger no longer tight on the trigger. "He's a spy," Samuel Cross said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "A threat to everything we've built." "What threat?" Rebecca demanded. "What has he taken from you? What damage has he done?" "He helped a starving woman and child survive. If that's what you call an act of war, then maybe war is what you deserve." Greywolf, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, managed to speak despite his pain. "I have lived among the whites," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet. "I have seen your cities, learned your language, studied your ways. If I wished your settlement harm, I would not need spies or elaborate plans." He gestured toward the scattered riders with his good arm. "I could have killed any of you from ambush, taken your horses, burned your buildings while you slept. Instead, I chose to feed a hungry child. Which of us is truly the savage?" The words hit their mark with devastating precision. Rebecca could see the doubt spreading through the group like wildfire, doubt about their actions, their assumptions, their very conception of who was civilized and who was not. But Caleb refused to be swayed by moral arguments. "Pretty speeches won't change facts," he snarled. "Indian is Indian, and Indians are our enemies. Period." He raised his gun again, this time aiming directly at Rebecca. "You want to protect your savage friend so badly? Fine. Die with him." That's when Elijah finally broke. For 3 weeks, he'd watched his wife struggle for survival. At the settlement's edge, had seen her refuse to abandon the child he couldn't accept. Every day of her persistence had been a knife twisting in his gut, a reminder of the choice he'd made and the price it had demanded. Now, seeing his brother about to murder the woman he'd once loved, something fundamental shattered inside him. "Caleb, no." Elijah roared, spurring his horse forward with desperate speed. "God damn it, no!" But he was too far away to intervene directly. All he could do was shout a warning as his brother's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun roared. Rebecca threw herself sideways, trying to shield Thomas from the bullet. And Greywolf, wounded, and bleeding summoned his last reserves of strength to throw himself between the gun and the woman who'd shown him that courage could take many forms. The second bullet took him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to his knees in the blood-stained snow. But his sacrifice had accomplished its purpose. Rebecca and her baby were unharmed, protected by his body from the bullet meant for them. As Greywolf collapsed, his blood soaking into the earth, a terrible silence fell over the battlefield. The sound of the baby's cries seemed impossibly loud. In the sudden quiet, a reminder of the innocence that had been at stake in this savage confrontation. Caleb stood over the fallen warrior, his smoking gun still in his hand, his face set in grim satisfaction. "One problem solved?" he said coldly. "Now for the other." But as he turned toward Rebecca, he found himself facing not just a defenseless woman, but 8 sets of eyes that reflected horror at what they'd just witnessed. Marcus Webb spoke first, his young voice shaking with emotion. "Jesus Christ, Caleb, what have we done?" The question hung in the frozen air like an accusation. But Caleb's response revealed the full depth of his moral blindness. "We've done what needed doing," he said, working to reload his pistol with mechanical precision. "What should have been done weeks ago?" He gestured toward Greywolf's still form with casual dismissal. "One less savage to worry about. And now we finish the job properly." But something had fundamentally changed in the aftermath of the shooting. The other riders sat their horses in stunned silence, staring at the blood spreading across the snow at Rebecca, clutching her baby as she knelt beside the man who died protecting them. "This isn't right," Marcus Webb said, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't who we're supposed to be." "Shut up, boy," Caleb snarled. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "Don't I?" Marcus dismounted, his young face set with determination Rebecca had never seen before. "I understand that we just murdered a man who was trying to protect a mother and child. I understand that we've become the very savages we claim to be fighting against." Big Tom Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Maybe the boy's got a point, Caleb. This has gone further than any of us intended. Further than you intended, maybe," Caleb replied. "But I came here to solve a problem permanently. The woman's survival makes us look weak. Her consorting with Indians makes us look like traitors. Both problems need to be eliminated." Samuel Cross, his military bearings still intact, despite the moral chaos swirling around them, tried to impose some order on the situation. "Caleb, we need to think this through. There will be consequences. The only consequence that matters is survival." Caleb interrupted. "Our survival. Our community's survival. Not the feelings of bleeding hearts who'd rather see us all dead than make the hard choices." He raised his pistol again this time, pointing it directly at Rebecca's head. "This ends now." That's when Rebecca did something that shocked everyone present, including herself. Instead of cowering or pleading, she looked up at Caleb with eyes that blazed with a fury that matched his own. "What? Go ahead," she said, her voice steady despite the gun pointed at her face. "Pull that trigger. Murder a mother and her baby in cold blood right here where everyone can see what kind of man you really are." Caleb's hand wavered slightly. "Don't test me, woman. I'm not testing you," Rebecca replied, shifting to cradle Thomas more protectively while never taking her eyes off Caleb's face. "I'm showing them who you are. You talk about survival and strength, but you're the weakest man here. So weak that you have to murder babies to feel strong." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Caleb's face flushed red with rage, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "This child," she said, raising Thomas so everyone could see his face. "This perfect, beautiful child that you want to kill, he's not just mine. He carries blood that belongs to this settlement, to this community you claim to be protecting." She turned to look directly at Elijah, who sat frozen on his horse, like a man caught in a nightmare. "Tell them, Elijah. Tell them whose son this really is." Elijah's face went white as death. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind through the pines and the baby's soft breathing. "He's not my son," Elijah said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Isn't he?" Rebecca's voice rose with emotional intensity that cut through every man present like a knife. "Look at his eyes, Elijah. Look at the shape of his face. Look at the stubborn set of his jaw that he got from his father." She stood slowly still, holding Thomas, her gaze never leaving her husband's face. "This baby is your son, born of your seed and my body. He carries your blood, your legacy, your future. And you threw him away because his arm doesn't work the way you think it should." The revelation crashed over the assembled men like an avalanche. Even Caleb's gun hand wavered as the implications sank in. "That's impossible," Caleb said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Elijah said, "Elijah lied." Rebecca cut him off. "To you, to himself, to everyone." Because accepting the truth would mean admitting that his perfect bloodline produced an imperfect child. Elijah's composure finally cracked completely. "Stop it," he whispered, then louder. "Stop it. I won't listen to this." "You'll listen," Rebecca said with relentless determination. "Because this is the truth you've been running from. This child is your son, and you sentenced him to death because you couldn't bear to admit that your own flesh and blood wasn't perfect." She turned to face the other men, her voice carrying across the battlefield with the authority of absolute moral certainty. "This is what you came here to do. Not to protect your community, but to cover up one man's shame. To murder his own grandson, because acknowledging the child's existence would force you all to admit that maybe, just maybe, being different doesn't mean being worthless." The words hung in the air, like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Around the circle, Rebecca could see the men processing the revelation, understanding, finally dawning, about what they'd really come here to do. Marcus Webb was the first to speak. "Jesus, Elijah, your own son. He's not." Elijah started, then stopped. Looking at Thomas, really looking at him for the first time since his birth, he couldn't deny what was obvious to anyone with eyes. The baby did have Elijah's eyes. The same dark blue that had attracted Rebecca during their courtship. The same stubborn jawline that marked all the Hartwell men. Even his good hand, when it moved, showed the long fingers that came from his father's side of the family. "My God." Elijah breathed the words barely audible. "What have I done?" But Caleb wasn't ready to surrender his moral certainty so easily. Blood or no blood, the child is still a cripple. Still a burden. Still a sign of weakness that will get us all killed. He raised his gun again, this time with grim finality. Family sentiment won't stop Indian raiders or outlaws who see a community that coddles its defectives. That's when Greywolf, who everyone had assumed was dead, managed to speak one final time. "The child." He gasped, his voice barely a whisper, but somehow carrying to every man present. "The child will be what you make him. Burden or bridge to something better." His eyes fixed on Rebecca with enormous effort. "Tell him, when he's grown, tell him Running Bear saw his future, and it was bright with possibility." Then his eyes closed for the final time, and the Cheyenne warrior who died protecting a white woman and her child was gone. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of grown men weeping, some for the warrior who'd shown them what courage really looked like, others for the realization of what they'd almost done, and at least one for the son he'd thrown away in his fear and pride. Caleb stood alone now, his gun the only thing between him and the complete collapse of everything he'd believed about strength, survival, and what it meant to be civilized. "It doesn't matter," he said, but his voice shook with desperation rather than conviction. "None of it matters. We still can't afford weakness. We still can't—" "Can't what?" Marcus Webb interrupted, stepping between Caleb and Rebecca. can't afford to protect our own children, can't afford to show mercy to those who need it most. Other men began to move, positioning themselves around Rebecca and her baby, not to threaten, but to protect. Big Tom Fletcher dismounted heavily, his massive frame serving as a shield between Caleb's gun and the woman who'd shown them all what real strength looked like. Even Samuel Cross, the military man who'd supported the harsh decision from the beginning, slowly shook his head. "Stand down, Caleb. This ends here. You're all fools." Caleb snarled, but he was outnumbered now, facing not just physical opposition, but the complete moral collapse of his position. "Weak-minded fools who'll get us all killed with your sentiment." He backed toward his horse, his gun still drawn, but no longer pointed at anyone specific. "Fine. Keep your crippled babies and your Indian-loving outcasts. But when the Cheyenne come for revenge, when raiders see how soft you've gotten, don't come crying to me." Caleb mounted his horse with angry jerks, his face twisted with disgust and defeat. "This settlement is doomed," he spat, "and you've doomed yourselves." He spurred his horse toward the territorial boundary, leaving behind a group of men who were finally beginning to understand the difference between strength and cruelty, between survival and simple brutality. As his hoofbeats faded into the distance, Rebecca knelt again beside Greywolf's body, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of gratitude to the man who'd given his life so that her son might live. And in the terrible quiet that followed, 8 men who'd come to commit murder instead found themselves face to face with the hardest truth of all, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. The ride back to Pine Ridge Settlement passed in heavy silence, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft sound of Rebecca's tears. She rode behind Marcus Webb on his horse, Thomas bundled securely in her arms, while Greywolf's body was carried across Big Tom Fletcher's saddle with all the dignity they could manage. It was a strange procession, former enemies united by grief and a growing understanding of what they'd almost lost. Elijah rode apart from the others, his face a mask of anguish that went deeper than simple regret. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to the bundle in Rebecca's arms, the son he'd cast out, the child whose existence he'd tried to deny. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical burden. "What do we tell people?" Marcus asked quietly as the settlement came into view. Samuel Cross, who'd resumed his role as de facto leader after Caleb's departure, considered the question carefully. "We tell them the truth, that we made a terrible mistake, and that it took a man we called Savage to show us what civilization really means." The news of their return spread quickly through Pine Ridge. People emerged from cabins and businesses to watch the solemn procession, their faces reflecting confusion and growing alarm as they saw Rebecca, the woman they'd exiled to die, returning with her child, very much alive. But it was the sight of Greywolf's body that truly shocked them. Word spread in whispers the Cheyenne warrior was dead killed while protecting the very woman the settlement had cast out. The implications were staggering. Doc Morrison took charge of Greywolf's body with quiet efficiency, his medical training overriding any personal feelings about treating a dead Indian. "He'll have a proper burial," he announced to no one in particular. Christian or heathen a man who dies protecting innocence deserves that much. Constance Morrison, the preacher's wife, who'd been instrumental in Rebecca's exile, stood frozen in her doorway as the procession passed, her eyes fixed on Thomas, seeing for the first time not a burden or a curse, but simply a baby who needed care and protection. "My God," she whispered to her husband, "what have we done?" The reckoning that followed was swift and thorough. As the truth of what had happened spread through the settlement, the moral foundations that had supported Rebecca's exile crumbled like a dam under flood pressure. Martha Fletcher, Big Tom's wife, was the first to break. She appeared at Rebecca's temporary shelter, a corner of the church that Reverend Morrison had hastily prepared with supplies and an apology that came from the depths of her soul. "I was afraid," she said, simply placing jars of preserved food and baby clothes beside Rebecca's makeshift bed. afraid that showing mercy would make us weak. Instead, showing cruelty made us monsters. Others followed. Sarah Webb brought fresh milk and warm clothes. Even Jonas Hartley from the general store appeared with supplies, his usual worry replaced by something approaching shame. "No charge," he said gruffly when Rebecca tried to offer payment. "Consider it. Compensation for services the community should have provided from the beginning." But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. 3 days after Greywolf's burial, a small delegation of Cheyenne warriors appeared at the settlement's edge, led by an elderly chief whose dignity was evident, even to eyes untrained in reading Indian customs. The settlement's men reached for weapons out of instinct, but Samuel Cross held up a restraining hand. "Let's see what they want before we start shooting." The chief spoke in halting English, his words carefully chosen and weighted with significance. "I am Standing Bear, leader of the band that claims this hunting ground. I come to speak of Greywolf, who died among your people." The crowd that had gathered tensed, expecting demands for vengeance or compensation. Instead, Standing Bear's next words caught them completely off guard. "My warrior chose to protect a white woman and child. He broke our laws to do this thing knowing it might bring war between our peoples. I come to understand why he thought their lives worth such a risk." Rebecca stepped forward, Thomas in her arms, her heart pounding as she faced the man whose decision could determine whether Greywolf's sacrifice would lead to more bloodshed. "Your warrior saved our lives," she said simply. "He died because he chose to see us as people deserving protection rather than enemies deserving death." Standing Bear studied her face, then looked down at the baby she held. "Show me the child my warrior died for." With trembling hands, Rebecca pulled back the blanket to reveal Thomas's face and his withered arm. The chief examined the baby with eyes that missed nothing, taking in both the child's limitation and his obvious health and alertness. "Among my people," Standing Bear said finally, "we would say this child was marked by the spirits for a special purpose." Greywolf saw this marking and understood its meaning. He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small carved figure a bear made from dark wood, polished smooth by countless hands. This belonged to Greywolf's brother, who was also born different from other children. Greywolf carried it to remember that strength comes in many forms. Standing Bear placed the carving in Rebecca's hands. "Give this to the boy when he is old enough to understand. Tell him that Running Bear, for that was Greywolf's true name, believed his future was bright with possibility." The gesture of peace and understanding left the settlement speechless. Here was the very chief they'd feared might demand vengeance, instead offering wisdom and acceptance. "There will be no war over this," Standing Bear continued. "My warrior chose his path knowing the consequences. But his choice has shown both our peoples something important about the courage required to build bridges instead of walls." As the Cheyenne delegation prepared to leave, Standing Bear made one final observation that would haunt and inspire the settlement for months to come. "Your warrior woman fought harder for her child's life than many men fight for their own honor. Perhaps there is hope for understanding between peoples who can produce such courage." The chief's words echoed long after the Indians had disappeared back into the wilderness, leaving behind a community forced to confront fundamental questions about strength, weakness, and what it truly meant to survive in an unforgiving land. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the garden behind the cottage she'd built on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, watching Thomas take his first tentative steps across the soft earth. The settlement had changed dramatically in the aftermath of Greywolf's death. Caleb's departure had created a power vacuum filled by men like Marcus Webb and a chastened Samuel Cross leaders who understood that true strength sometimes required protecting the vulnerable rather than casting them out. Pine Ridge had become something unique on the frontier, a community that measured its success not just by survival, but by how well it cared for those who needed help most. Other settlements sent their problem families to Pine Ridge, knowing they'd find acceptance rather than exile. Rebecca's cottage stood as a symbol of that transformation. Built with lumber donated by the community and labor provided by men seeking to atone for past cruelty, it housed not just Rebecca and Thomas, but a small school where children with various challenges could learn alongside their more typical peers. "Look at him go," Doc Morrison said, emerging from the cottage with his medical bag. He'd become a regular visitor, monitoring Thomas's development with the intensity of a man making up for lost time. "His balance is perfect. That arm won't slow him down a bit." Rebecca smiled, watching her son grab a wooden horse carved by Big Tom Fletcher and immediately try to examine it with both hands and mouth. Greywolf was right. He is different strong. The transformation in Elijah had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. The man who'd cast out his own son had spent months in a kind of penance that went far beyond simple regret. He'd sold his ranch and used the money to fund the construction of Rebecca's cottage and school. He'd worked alongside other men to build homes for families other settlements had rejected. But despite his efforts at redemption, the gulf between him and Rebecca remained unbridgeable. Too much had been said, too much damage done for their marriage to survive the weight of his choices. "He asks about you," Rebecca told him during one of his visits to see Thomas. "Wonders who the sad man is who brings him toys and sits so quietly." Elijah's face crumpled with grief. Does he seem to recognize me at all?" "Children know love when they see it," Rebecca said gently, "even when it comes with regret attached." Their divorce had been finalized in Cheyenne a month earlier, an unusual arrangement on the frontier, but one supported by the territorial judge who'd heard their story. Elijah had signed over all rights to his son, acknowledging what everyone could see, that Thomas was better off with a mother who loved him unconditionally than a father still learning to see past his own fear. As autumn approached, Rebecca received a letter that would change everything once again. It came from Massachusetts, from a cousin she'd barely remembered, until desperation drove her to reach out to distant family. "Dearest Rebecca, your letter has moved our entire community to tears and action. My husband and I have established a school here in Brookfield specifically for children who learn differently or face physical challenges that others might see as limitations. We have immediate need for a teacher with your experience and understanding. The position includes a cottage for you and Thomas, and a community that already understands the difference between different and broken. Please say yes. We need teachers who know that true education means seeing potential where others see only problems. With hope and love, Catherine Porter Whitman." Rebecca read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit her. A job, a community, a place where Thomas could grow up knowing his differences were strengths rather than burdens. That evening, she sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold while Thomas played with his carved bear. Standing Bear's gift had become his constant companion, a tangible link to the warrior who'd believed in his future. "What do you think?" she asked the baby, who responded by showing her the bear with obvious pride. "Ready for another adventure?" Footsteps on the path announced a visitor. Marcus Webb approached with his hat in his hands, looking younger than his years, despite the responsibilities he'd taken on as the settlement's new leader. "Heard you might be leaving us," he said, settling onto the porch step beside her. "News travels fast. In a settlement this size, everything travels fast." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas investigate a butterfly that had landed near his feet. "Can't say I blame you for wanting to go. This place holds a lot of painful memories." Rebecca considered his words carefully. "It holds painful memories, yes. But it also holds the place where I learned what I was truly capable of. Where Thomas learned he could survive anything. Where a warrior named Running Bear showed us all what courage really looks like." She gestured toward the settlement below, where lights were beginning to appear in windows as families gathered for evening meals. "Pine Ridge isn't the same place that cast us out. The people aren't the same people who turned their backs on a starving child. But Thomas deserves to grow up somewhere that was always ready to love him, not somewhere that had to learn how." Marcus nodded, understanding. "When will you leave?" Next week. There's a wagon train heading east that's agreed to take us as far as the railroad. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the valley. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a sound that had once represented danger, but now seemed like simply another voice in the wilderness chorus. "There's something you should know," Marcus said finally. "About Caleb." Rebecca tensed. Reports of Elijah's brother had been sporadic and troubling tales of a man growing increasingly unstable as he moved from settlement to settlement, spreading his poisonous philosophy of strength through exclusion. "He showed up in Deadwood last month," Marcus continued. "Started the same kind of trouble he caused here, trying to convince people that showing mercy was the same as showing weakness." "What happened?" Marcus's smile was grim. Turns out Deadwood already had their own version of Greywolf, a Chinese doctor who'd been treating minors regardless of their ability to pay. When Caleb tried to organize a campaign against foreign influence, he found himself facing a town that remembered what kindness looked like. They ran him out. Worse, they ignored him completely. Caleb's whole philosophy depends on fear and anger to spread. When people just refuse to listen, when they choose kindness over hatred, men like him become powerless. Marcus stood to leave, then paused. "That's the real legacy of what happened here, Rebecca. Not just that we learned to do better, but that we're teaching other places they can do better too." After he left, Rebecca remained on the porch with Thomas, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Tomorrow would bring preparations for departure farewells to the community that had cast her out and then fought to redeem itself. But tonight, she simply held her son and remembered the warrior who'd believed in both their futures. A week later, as the wagon train prepared to depart, Rebecca was surprised by the size of the crowd that gathered to see them off. Nearly the entire settlement had turned out bearing gifts and well wishes for the journey ahead. Constance Morrison, the preacher's wife, who'd once condemned Rebecca's choices, pressed a carefully wrapped bundle into her hands. "Books," she explained quietly, "for when Thomas is ready to learn his letters. And a letter of recommendation for any school that might question your qualifications." Doc Morrison contributed medical supplies and a detailed report on Thomas's health that emphasized his remarkable resilience and normal development in all areas except the obvious. "Show this to any doctor who tries to tell you that boy can't have a full life," he said gruffly. Even Elijah came to say goodbye, though he hung back from the crowd as if unsure of his welcome. When Rebecca approached him, she saw a man aged beyond his years by guilt and loss. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I understand why you can't forgive me. What I did, there's no excuse for it." Rebecca studied his face, seeing genuine remorse, but also the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. "I don't forgive you, Elijah. But I don't hate you either. Hate would be just another burden to carry, and Thomas and I have traveled far enough with heavy hearts." She shifted her son in her arms so Elijah could see his face clearly. "Your son is going to have a good life, a full life. He's going to grow up knowing he's loved and valued exactly as he is." Elijah's eyes filled with tears. Will you tell him about me someday, about his father?" "I'll tell him his father was a man who made terrible mistakes but tried to learn from them. I'll tell him that people can change and that love sometimes comes disguised as letting go." As the wagon train rolled east across the prairie, Rebecca held Thomas on her lap and told him stories about the warrior who'd protected them, about the community that had learned to choose love over fear, and about the bright future waiting for them in Massachusetts. But she saved the most important story for last, the tale of a little boy who'd been born different in a world that feared difference, and who taught everyone around him that the greatest strength of all was simply refusing to give up on love. 3 years later, a letter arrived in Brookfield from Pine Ridge Settlement. It was signed by Marcus Webb, now the town's mayor, and contained news that made Rebecca laugh and cry in equal measure. The settlement had officially changed its name to Running Bear Crossing in honor of the Cheyenne warrior, whose sacrifice had taught them the true meaning of civilization. The letter included a photograph of a small monument erected near the spot where Greywolf had died, a simple stone marker bearing his name in both English and Cheyenne, with an inscription that read, "He chose to build bridges where others saw only walls." But the most remarkable news was saved for the end. Pine Ridge, now Running Bear Crossing, had become something unprecedented on the frontier, a place where Indian and white children learned together in the same schoolhouse, where Cheyenne families traded peacefully alongside white settlers, where Chief Standing Bear served as an unofficial advisor to the town council. "It's not perfect," Marcus wrote. "There are still tensions, still people on both sides who think we're all crazy. But it's a start. It's proof that Greywolf's vision was possible, that bridges can be built by people brave enough to try." Rebecca read the letter aloud to Thomas now, a bright 3-year-old whose withered arm had never slowed him down for a moment. He was already learning to read, already showing the quick intelligence and stubborn determination that marked him as his mother's son. "Tell me about Running Bear again," Thomas said as he did every night before bed. So Rebecca told him once more about the warrior who'd seen strength where others saw weakness, who'd chosen protection over prejudice, who'd believed that a little boy with one good arm could change the world. And in the garden behind their Massachusetts cottage, where plants from sacred Cheyenne mountains grew alongside New England wildflowers, Thomas grew stronger each day, different strong, just as Greywolf had promised. The seeds of understanding planted in blood and sacrifice on a Wyoming mountainside were taking root in soil made rich by love, tended by hands that had learned the difference between surviving and truly living. In the end, that difference made all the difference in the world.